The screams echoed through the jungle canopy as dawn broke over Chichen Itza. Steam rose from the sacred cenote, its dark waters reflecting the first pale light while something far more sinister stirred beneath the surface. On the pyramid summit, priests in jade and obsidian raised their blades toward the sky, their faces painted with the colors of gods who demanded blood. Below, thousands of Maya gathered in the plaza, their voices rising in chants that had summoned death for over a millennium. Children clutched offerings of copal incense while nobles adorned in quetzal feathers watched from stone platforms. But all eyes turned upward, toward the altar where a beating heart would soon be torn from a living chest. This wasn't murder. In the Maya world, it was the highest form of devotion, a cosmic transaction that kept the sun rising and the rains falling. The Maya didn't just practice human sacrifice, they perfected it into an art form of terror that would make even Rome's gladiators pale in comparison. From the blood-soaked ball courts of Tikal to the drowning pools of Chichen Itza, we're about to descend into the most horrific rituals ever conceived by human minds. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that turned suffering into sacred duty and transformed screams into prayers. Before we dive into this abyss of ancient horror, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration into history's darkest corners. Now, prepare yourself. The drums are beating, the obsidian blades are sharpening, and the gods are growing hungry. The sacred mathematics of death. The Maya calendar wasn't just a way to track time, it was a blueprint for when blood must flow. Every 20 days marked a new month that demanded its tribute. Every 52 years brought a calendar round that required extraordinary sacrifice. And every 394 years, the great cycle demanded offerings so massive that entire cities would empty their populations onto altar stones. Mathematics and murder intertwined in ways that would have impressed even the most calculating Roman emperor. Maya priests calculated eclipses, predicted Venus cycles, and charted the movement of stars, all to determine the perfect moments when human hearts should stop beating. They didn't sacrifice randomly, they killed with cosmic precision. The Dresden Codex, one of the few Maya books to survive Spanish flames, reveals tables that correlate astronomical events with ritual requirements. When Venus disappeared behind the sun for 8 days, prisoners of war would be flayed alive. When Mars reached its brightest point, children would be drowned in sacred wells. The universe itself became an execution schedule written in hieroglyphs in blood. But the Maya went further than mere timing. They developed a sophisticated theology that divided sacrifice into categories, each serving different divine appetites. Kinich Janab Pakal, the great ruler of Palenque, commissioned murals that depicted 9 distinct types of offerings: heart extraction, drowning, flaying, burning, dismemberment, strangulation, arrow sacrifice, mass burial, and the most terrifying of all, the slow death, where victims were kept alive for days while pieces of their bodies were systematically removed. Each method corresponded to specific gods and cosmic needs. Chak, the rain deity, preferred drowning victims in cenotes, natural limestone sinkholes that the Maya believed were portals to the underworld. Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, demanded hearts torn from living chests at the moment of sunrise. And Naapuk, lord of death, required the slow torture of captives over multiple days, their agony feeding his eternal hunger. The precision extended to victim selection. Not everyone was worthy of divine consumption. Warriors captured in battle held the highest value, their courage seasoning their blood for the gods. Children, especially those born under specific calendar signs, were prized for their purity. Twins were considered especially sacred, believed to embody the hero twins of Maya mythology who had journeyed to the underworld and returned. But perhaps most chilling was the Maya practice of breeding sacrificial victims. Archaeological evidence from sites like Copan reveals compounds where prisoners were kept for months or even years, fed specific diets to enhance their spiritual potency. These weren't prisons, they were human farms, cultivating flesh for divine consumption. The mathematics of death reached its peak during the Terminal Classic period, roughly 800 to 900 CE, when Maya cities competed to offer the most elaborate sacrifices. Inscriptions at Dos Pilas record a single ceremony that consumed over 400 captives in a 3-day festival. The logistics alone stagger the imagination, coordinating the capture, transport, preparation, and execution of hundreds of human beings, all timed to astronomical perfection. Yet for the Maya, these weren't acts of barbarity but of profound religious devotion. They believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and humans owed the same debt in return. Every drop of blood spilled was a payment on cosmic rent, keeping the universe from collapsing into chaos. The ball game of death. Picture a sport where losing meant more than disappointment. It meant having your head severed and used as the ball for the next match. The Maya ball game, known as pits, wasn't recreation. It was ritual combat that ended in sacrifice, a deadly dance that reenacted the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. The courts themselves were architectural marvels designed for death. At Chichen Itza, the Great Ball Court stretches 545 feet long and 225 feet wide, its walls rising like canyon cliffs on either side. But look closer at the stone carvings that line these walls, and you'll see the true purpose: decapitated players, their necks spurting blood that transforms into serpents, their heads held aloft by victorious opponents. The game's rules remain partially mysterious, but the stakes were always clear. Two teams attempted to pass a solid rubber ball weighing up to 9 pounds through stone hoops mounted high on the court walls, using only their hips, forearms, and shoulders. Players wore protective gear made from wood and leather, but it offered little comfort when the penalty for losing was death. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed these games described the thunderous sound of the rubber ball striking stone, echoing through the courts like cannon fire. The ball itself was symbolic, representing the sun's journey through the underworld, the severed head of a defeated god, or the cosmic forces that the Maya believed governed existence. But the true horror lay in what happened after the final point was scored. The losing team, sometimes the winning team, depending on the ritual requirements, would be led to the center of the court for sacrifice. Murals at El Tajin show the process in gruesome detail, players kneeling as priests approach with obsidian knives, their teammates watching as hearts are torn from chests and offered to stone gods who leer from the court walls. Archaeological excavations beneath ball courts have revealed the skeletal remains of hundreds of players, their bones showing evidence of the brutal injuries that preceded death. Skulls cracked by rubber balls, ribs shattered by impact with stone walls, and the telltale marks of decapitation that ended their agony. The most elaborate ball game sacrifices occurred during the dedication of new courts or the coronation of rulers. At Copan, inscriptions describe a ceremony where captured enemy nobles were forced to play against local champions. The foreign players, already weakened by months of captivity, stood little chance against fresh opponents. Their inevitable defeat provided both entertainment and divine offering, their deaths sanctifying the new court with royal blood. Some courts featured additional horrors. At Zoltan, archaeologists discovered channels carved into the court floor, designed to drain blood toward central collection points. The crimson liquid would be gathered in jade bowls and offered to specific deities, ensuring that no drop of sacred fluid was wasted. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical violence. Players knew the stakes before they entered the court, yet Maya society demanded they compete with honor and skill. To refuse meant dishonor worse than death, to play meant probable execution. This impossible choice was itself part of the ritual, forcing participants to confront their mortality while thousands watched from the surrounding stands. Even the timing of these deadly games followed astronomical patterns. Major matches coincided with solar eclipses, when the Maya believed the sun god was being devoured by cosmic jaguars. The blood spilled on Earth was thought to strengthen the sun's fight against darkness, ensuring that light would return to the world. The ball courts also served as theaters for reenacting Maya creation myths. Players took on the roles of the hero twins, legendary figures who had defeated the lords of the underworld through cunning and skill. But unlike the mythical heroes who emerged victorious, real players faced very real death, their sacrifice completing the cosmic cycle that the stories had begun. The cenote of screaming souls deep beneath the Yucatan Peninsula, limestone caverns hold water so still it mirrors the darkness above. These cenotes, natural sinkholes that the Maya considered gateways to Xibalba, the underworld, became drowning pools for the most sacred and most terrifying of all sacrifices. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza stretches nearly 200 feet across, its waters plunging 65 feet into blackness that seems to swallow light itself. For over 1,000 years, Maya priests hurled offerings into these depths, jade jewelry, gold ornaments, copal incense, and human beings whose screams echoed off the limestone walls before being silenced forever by the dark water below. When American archaeologist Edward Thompson dredged the cenote in the early 1900s, he pulled up a catalogue of horror that confirmed the Spanish chronicler's most nightmarish accounts. Skeletons of children, their small bones showing evidence of violent death. Adult remains with skulls crushed by ceremonial clubs. And most disturbing of all, evidence that some victims had been thrown into the cenote while still alive, left to drown in the sacred darkness. The Maya believed these drowning deaths served Chak, the rain god whose tears brought life to their crops. But Chak was a demanding deity who required specific types of victims offered in precise ways. Children were preferred, their innocence making their deaths more potent offerings. The youngest victims, some barely old enough to walk, were adorned with jade jewelry and gold ornaments before being cast into the depths. Spanish Bishop Diego de Landa, writing in the 16th century, described the cenote ceremonies in horrifying detail. They had the custom of throwing living men into the cenote at Chichen Itza as a sacrifice to their gods in times of drought, believing they would not die though they never saw them again. They also threw many valuable objects of precious stones and things they prized. But Landa's account, shocking as it was, only scratched the surface of the cenote's horrors. Recent underwater archaeology has revealed that the sacred cenote was used for sacrifice for over 8 centuries, from roughly 600 CE to 1400 CE. The limestone bottom is carpeted with human bones, creating an underwater ossuary that speaks to the scale of death that fed the rain god's hunger. The rituals surrounding cenote sacrifice were as elaborate as they were deadly. Victims were often kept in ceremonial preparation for weeks before their deaths, fed special diets and subjected to purification rituals that were meant to enhance their spiritual potency. Children were given hallucinogenic drugs to calm them before the final plunge, their drugged compliance making them easier to handle and more acceptable to the gods. The timing of cenote sacrifices followed the agricultural calendar with deadly precision. During the dry season, when crops withered and water sources dwindled, the frequency of drowning deaths increased dramatically. Archaeological evidence suggests that during severe droughts, the Maya would sacrifice dozens of victims in a single ceremony, their combined deaths meant to convince Chak to open the heavens and release the rains. But the cenotes weren't just execution sites, they were also oracles. Maya priests would interpret the way victims sank or floated, the sounds they made as they drowned, and the patterns their blood created on the water's surface. These death throes were read like sacred texts, providing guidance for everything from military campaigns to agricultural planning. Some cenotes featured additional tortures before the final drowning. At sites like Zabilchultan, archaeologists have found evidence of platforms built over cenote openings, where victims were suspended above the water for hours or days before being released. The psychological torment of hanging over their watery grave, knowing death was inevitable but not knowing when it would come, was itself part of the offering. The Maya also practiced a particularly cruel form of cenote sacrifice involving false hope. Victims would be thrown into shallower cenotes where survival was possible, then hunted through the underground cave systems by priests wielding spears and clubs. These deadly games of hide-and-seek could last for days, the victims' terror and exhaustion seasoning their eventual deaths for divine consumption. Even the Spanish conquest couldn't immediately end the cenote sacrifices. Hidden ceremonies continued in remote areas well into the colonial period, with Maya priests adapting their rituals to avoid detection. Some cenotes show evidence of sacrifice as late as the 18th century, suggesting that the tradition survived in secret for over 200 years after the fall of the last Maya kingdoms. The flaying festivals of Kukulkan, when the feathered serpent demanded tribute, the Maya didn't simply kill, they peeled away skin like husking corn, creating living sculptures of agony that would make medieval torturers weep with envy. The flaying festivals of Kukulkan represented the pinnacle of Maya sacrificial artistry, where death became performance and suffering transformed into sacred theater. The process began with the selection of victims during the spring equinox, when Kukulkan was believed to descend the steps of his pyramid at Chichen Itza. Captured warriors, preferably enemy nobles whose high status would honor the serpent god, were chosen for this most elaborate of deaths. But selection was only the beginning of a ritual that could stretch across multiple days of calculated torment. Maya priests had perfected flaying into a precise science. Using obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical steel, they would make careful incisions that preserved the victim's life while slowly removing the skin in large, intact pieces. The goal wasn't quick death but prolonged consciousness. The victim had to remain aware as their flesh was methodically stripped away, their screams serving as prayers to the feathered serpent above. The Codex Borgia, though created by Central Mexican cultures influenced by Maya practices, illustrates the flaying process in stomach-churning detail. Victims are shown suspended from wooden frames while priests work with the patience of artists, their obsidian tools glinting in torchlight as skin peels away in ribbons. The flayed flesh wasn't discarded but carefully preserved, often worn by priests during subsequent ceremonies as sacred garments that connected them to the divine. Archaeological evidence from sites like Palenque reveals specialized tools designed specifically for flaying, curved obsidian knives with handles carved to provide precise grip, stone platforms with drainage channels to collect blood, and restraining devices that held victims motionless while preserving their ability to feel every cut. These weren't crude implements of torture but sophisticated instruments crafted for maximum suffering. The timing of flaying festivals followed astronomical calculations that would have impressed Renaissance astronomers. The ceremonies began when Venus reached its maximum brightness as the morning star, continued through specific lunar phases, and concluded when the planet disappeared behind the sun. Each phase of the astronomical cycle corresponded to different stages of the flaying process, creating a cosmic choreography of death that lasted for weeks. But the Maya added psychological torments that went beyond physical pain. Victims were forced to watch as their own skin was prepared for ritual use, seeing pieces of themselves transformed into sacred objects while they still lived. Family members were sometimes brought to witness the flaying, their grief and horror adding emotional seasoning to the divine offering. The priests who performed these rituals underwent years of training, learning not just the technical skills of flaying but the religious significance of each cut. Different parts of the body held different spiritual values. Facial skin was reserved for the most important ceremonies, hand and foot skin was used for minor rituals, and torso skin was crafted into drumheads that would sound during future sacrifices. Some flaying ceremonies incorporated elements of theater that blurred the line between ritual and performance. At Copan, murals depict flaying victims dressed as specific gods, their deaths reenacting mythological scenes while their skin was slowly removed. The audience wasn't just witnessing sacrifice but watching divine drama unfold in real flesh and blood. The Maya also practiced a particularly horrific variant called reverse flaying, where victims were kept alive after their skin was removed, their exposed flesh treated with salt and herbs to prevent immediate death from shock and infection. These living anatomical displays could survive for days, their raw bodies serving as walking offerings to Kukulkan's eternal hunger. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed these ceremonies struggled to find words for what they saw. Fray Diego Duran wrote, "The devil had taught them such cruelties that no Christian heart could bear to see them, yet they performed these acts with such devotion that they believed themselves to be serving God." His horror was understandable. Even the Spanish Inquisition, notorious for its creative tortures, had never conceived of flaying as a form of worship. The flayed skin itself became sacred material with multiple uses. Priests would wear it during ceremonies, believing it granted them temporary divine powers. The skin was also used to create ceremonial drums, masks, and even clothing for statues of Kukulkan. In death, the victims literally became part of the god they had died to honor. The children of the rain god. In the depths of Maya caves, archaeologists have uncovered humanity's most heartbreaking horror, the systematic sacrifice of children, their small bodies arranged in patterns that speak to rituals so calculated and cruel that they challenge our understanding of ancient devotion. These weren't random acts of violence but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that turned innocence into offering and transformed childhood into currency for divine favor. The Maya believed children held special power as sacrificial victims. Their purity made them ideal messengers to the gods, their innocence ensuring that divine communications wouldn't be corrupted by adult sins. But this theological reasoning masked a practice of such systematic cruelty that it would have shocked even Rome's most jaded arena spectators. At the cave site of Midnight Terror in Belize, researchers discovered the remains of over 100 children, ranging in age from infancy to adolescence, their bones telling stories of deliberate starvation, ritual mutilation, and prolonged torture before death. Carbon dating reveals these sacrifices occurred over several centuries, suggesting that child sacrifice wasn't an aberration but a cornerstone of Maya religious practice. The selection process for child victims followed strict criteria that reveal the calculated nature of these murders. Children born during specific calendar combinations were marked for sacrifice from birth, their fate determined by astronomical calculations that treated human life as cosmic currency. Twins were especially prized, believed to embody the hero twins of Maya mythology and therefore capable of carrying messages directly to the underworld. Physical characteristics also determined a child's sacrificial value. Those with crossed eyes, considered a mark of divine favor among the Maya, were reserved for the most important ceremonies. Children with unusual birthmarks or deformities were thought to bear the touch of gods and were therefore more potent offerings. Even hair color mattered. Lighter-haired children, rare among the Maya, were considered especially valuable to rain gods who were sometimes depicted with fair features. The preparation of child victims involved months of ritualized care that makes the practice even more disturbing. Selected children were removed from their families and housed in special compounds near major temples, where they were fed elaborate diets designed to enhance their spiritual potency. Archaeological analysis of their bones shows they consumed foods rich in specific minerals and proteins, suggesting their captors were literally fattening them for sacrifice. But the Maya didn't simply kill these children, they tortured them with methodical precision. Evidence from sites like Copan shows that many young victims suffered broken bones that had healed before death, indicating they endured multiple sessions of ritualized violence over extended periods. Some show signs of deliberate malnutrition alternated with periods of better feeding, suggesting their captors were manipulating their physical condition for maximum spiritual impact. The actual sacrifice methods varied depending on the intended divine recipient and the astronomical timing of the ceremony. Children offered to Chak, the rain god, were drowned in cenotes or specially constructed pools, their tears mixing with sacred water as they died. Those sacrificed to Atsamna, the creator deity, had their hearts removed while still beating, the organs offered while still warm to ensure divine acceptance. Perhaps most horrifying was the practice of slow sacrifice, where children were kept alive for days while pieces of their bodies were systematically removed. Spanish chronicler Bartolomé de las Casas described witnessing such a ceremony, writing, "They would cut off the child's fingers one by one, then the toes, then hands and feet, keeping the child alive through all this torment until finally removing the heart." His account, though written by a Spanish colonizer with his own agenda, aligns with archaeological evidence of systematic mutilation found at multiple Maya sites. The Maya also practiced a form of child sacrifice that involved burying victims alive in foundation deposits for new buildings. At Tikal, excavations beneath major temples have revealed the skeletons of children placed in specific positions within the structure's foundations, their deaths meant to sanctify the building and ensure divine protection. These children show no signs of violent death, suggesting they may have been drugged before burial, left to suffocate slowly in the darkness as the temple rose above them. The psychological impact on Maya society must have been profound. Parents lived with the constant fear that their children might be selected for sacrifice, yet the religious system demanded they accept such selection as divine honor. This created a culture where love and terror intertwined, where the birth of a child brought both joy and the possibility of ultimate loss. Some Maya communities developed elaborate rituals to hide their children from divine attention, using tattoos, scarification, and deliberate disfigurement to make them less appealing to the gods. But these protective measures were themselves risky. Too obvious an attempt to avoid sacrifice could be interpreted as defying divine will, potentially resulting in the entire family being marked for punishment. The living gods who demanded death. Maya rulers weren't just political leaders, they were living conduits to the divine realm, god-kings whose very existence required constant feeding with human blood. These royal figures orchestrated sacrifices on a scale that dwarfed even the most ambitious Roman spectacles, turning their courts into theaters of death where political power and religious devotion merged into a single, terrifying force. The concept of divine kingship among the Maya created a unique form of tyranny where murder became religious duty. Rulers like Jasa Chan Kawil of Tikal or Kinich Janab Pakal of Palenque weren't just demanding tribute from their subjects, they were literally demanding their lives as offerings to maintain cosmic balance. Every victory in war, every successful harvest, every astronomical event required blood payment, and the king served as both priest and executioner in these transactions with the gods. Royal sacrifices followed elaborate protocols that reveal the sophisticated bureaucracy of death that surrounded Maya courts. Inscriptions at Yaxchilan describe the administrative apparatus required for major sacrificial ceremonies, scribes to calculate astronomical timing, architects to design temporary altars, craftsmen to create specialized tools, and guards to manage the logistics of moving hundreds of victims from holding areas to execution sites. The scale of royal sacrifices could be staggering. When Jasa Chan Kawil celebrated his victory over rival Kalak Mul in 695 CE, inscriptions record that over 800 captives were sacrificed during a week-long festival. The logistics alone boggle the mind, feeding and housing hundreds of prisoners, coordinating their execution across multiple ceremonial sites, and disposing of the massive quantities of human remains that resulted from such slaughter. Maya kings also practiced a particularly cruel form of sacrifice that demonstrated their power over life and death, the execution of their own nobles and family members. During succession crises or major religious festivals, rulers would sacrifice close relatives to prove their devotion to the gods exceeded even familial bonds. These royal murders served dual purposes. They provided high-status victims whose noble blood was especially pleasing to the gods, while simultaneously eliminating potential political rivals. The most elaborate royal sacrifices occurred during the accession ceremonies of new kings, when the incoming ruler had to prove his divine mandate through spectacular displays of violence. At Kopan, the accession of Waxaklajun Aba Kawil in 695 CE was marked by the sacrifice of 18 captured enemy rulers, their deaths corresponding to the 18 months of the Maya calendar year. Each victim was killed in a different manner, their varied deaths meant to honor different aspects of the divine realm. But Maya kings didn't just order sacrifices, they participated directly in the killing, their hands literally stained with the blood of their victims. Royal iconography consistently shows rulers wielding sacrificial knives, holding severed heads, or standing over bound captives. These weren't symbolic representations but documentary evidence of kings who personally performed the murders that maintained their power. The psychological pressure on Maya rulers was immense. They lived with the constant knowledge that their divine status required them to kill regularly and spectacularly. Failure to provide adequate sacrifices could be interpreted as loss of divine favor, potentially triggering rebellions or invasions from rival kingdoms. This created a vicious cycle where political survival demanded ever more elaborate displays of violence. Some Maya kings became so addicted to sacrificial spectacle that they bankrupted their kingdoms pursuing increasingly elaborate ceremonies. The late ruler of Dos Pilas, whose name is lost to history, spent so much on sacrificial festivals that his city couldn't maintain its military defenses, leading to its eventual conquest and abandonment. His obsession with divine approval through murder ultimately destroyed the very kingdom he was trying to protect. The royal courts also developed sophisticated methods for preserving and displaying the results of their sacrificial activities. At Palenque, archaeologists have discovered elaborate bone workshops where human remains were processed into ceremonial objects, skulls carved into drinking cups, femurs fashioned into flutes, and ribcages transformed into decorative panels. These weren't just trophies but functional items that kept the dead present in daily court life. Maya queens participated in these sacrificial activities with equal enthusiasm and cruelty. Lady Six Sky of Naranjo personally oversaw the sacrifice of captured enemy nobles, while Lady Eveningstar of Yaxchilan is depicted in murals pulling thorned ropes through her tongue in bloodletting rituals that preceded major executions. Royal women weren't passive observers but active participants in the machinery of death that surrounded Maya courts. The divine kingship system also created elaborate protocols for the sacrifice of the kings themselves. When a ruler died, whether from natural causes or violence, his death required massive human offerings to ensure his successful journey to the underworld. The funeral of Kinich Janab Pakal involved the sacrifice of over 200 individuals. Their deaths meant to provide the dead king with servants and companions in the afterlife. The obsidian priests of pain behind every Maya sacrifice stood figures whose very existence was dedicated to perfecting the art of ritual murder, the obsidian priests, whose knowledge of human anatomy and capacity for inflicting prolonged agony would have impressed the most skilled torturers of any civilization. These weren't mere religious functionaries but specialists in death who spent decades mastering techniques that maximized both suffering and spiritual potency. The training of a sacrificial priest began in childhood, with selected boys removed from their families and inducted into temple schools where they learned the sacred mathematics of murder. They studied astronomy to calculate optimal timing for different types of sacrifice, anatomy to understand how to inflict maximum pain while preserving life, and theology to comprehend the spiritual significance of each cut, each scream, each drop of spilled blood. Archaeological evidence from priest quarters at sites like Chichen Itza reveals the sophisticated tools of their trade. Obsidian blades knapped to surgical sharpness, each designed for specific types of cuts. Bone needles for precise puncturing. Stone clamps for holding victims motionless. And most chilling of all, detailed anatomical models carved from jade and limestone that served as teaching aids for aspiring priests learning to navigate the human body with deadly precision. The obsidian itself held sacred significance that went beyond its practical sharpness. The Maya believed this volcanic glass was the crystallized blood of gods, making it the perfect material for returning human blood to the divine realm. Priests would spend months preparing a single blade, knapping and polishing the obsidian while reciting prayers that imbued the tool with spiritual power. Some blades were so sharp they could slice through skin without the victim initially feeling the cut, allowing priests to begin flaying procedures while their subjects remained unaware of what was happening. The hierarchy among sacrificial priests was as complex as any modern medical specialty. Junior priests handled routine executions, simple heart extractions or drownings that required basic skills. Senior priests specialized in elaborate procedures like flaying or dismemberment that demanded years of experience. And at the apex stood the master priests, whose knowledge of prolonged torture techniques was so advanced that they could keep victims alive and conscious for days while systematically destroying their bodies. These master priests developed techniques that reveal a sophisticated understanding of human physiology that wouldn't be matched by European medicine for centuries. They knew exactly which cuts would cause maximum pain without triggering fatal shock. They understood how to use tourniquets to prevent death from blood loss while continuing their work. And they had mastered the use of natural stimulants and pain enhancers that could keep victims conscious and responsive even during the most extreme tortures. The priests also served as living libraries of sacrificial knowledge, memorizing thousands of ritual variations that corresponded to different gods, astronomical events, and political needs. A sacrifice to Itzamna required different procedures than one offered to Kukulkan. A heart extraction performed during a solar eclipse followed different protocols than one conducted during the rainy season. This vast body of knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, with master priests spending decades training their successors in the precise techniques that pleased specific deities. But the psychological toll on these priests must have been enormous. They lived their entire lives surrounded by death, their hands permanently stained with blood, their dreams filled with the screams of their victims. Some inscriptions suggest that senior priests underwent their own forms of ritual mutilation, scarification, tooth filing, and deliberate deformation that marked them as servants of death and separated them from normal human society. The priests also developed elaborate purification rituals that they performed before and after major sacrifices. These ceremonies involved fasting, bloodletting from their own bodies, and consumption of hallucinogenic substances that they believed allowed them to commune directly with the gods they served. Archaeological analysis of priest burials shows evidence of chronic malnutrition and self-inflicted injuries that speak to lives of deliberate suffering in service to their deadly craft. Some priests specialized in specific types of victims, developing expertise in the sacrifice of children, warriors, or nobles that required different approaches and techniques. Child sacrifice specialists learned to work quickly and efficiently, minimizing the time between capture and death to preserve the innocence that made young victims spiritually potent. Warrior sacrifice experts developed techniques for breaking the will of captured fighters, using psychological torture to transform proud enemies into broken offerings. The most elite priests served as advisors to Maya rulers, their expertise in death making them valuable counselors on matters of war, politics, and religion. They could predict the spiritual impact of different military campaigns based on the sacrificial potential of enemy populations. They advised on the timing of major political decisions based on astronomical calculations that determined when the gods would be most receptive to blood offerings. The Spanish horror and the end of an age when Spanish conquistadors first witnessed Maya sacrifice, even these hardened veterans of European warfare found themselves confronted with horrors that challenged their understanding of human cruelty. Men who had seen the Inquisition's tortures, who had participated in the brutal conquest of the Aztecs, stood speechless before the systematic artistry of Maya ritual murder. Hernán Cortés, writing to King Charles V, struggled to find words for what he observed. They have a most horrid and abominable custom which truly ought to be punished and which until now we have seen in no other part, and this is that, whenever they wish to ask something of the idols, in order that their plea may find more acceptance, they take many girls and boys and even adults. And in the presence of these idols they open their chests while they are still alive and take out their hearts and entrails and burn them before the idols, offering the smoke as sacrifice. But Cortés's account, shocking as it was, barely scratched the surface of Maya sacrificial practices. Spanish chroniclers documented ceremonies that went far beyond simple heart extraction, describing elaborate rituals that combined multiple forms of torture into single, prolonged spectacles of death. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan bishop who became both chronicler and destroyer of Maya culture, wrote detailed accounts of sacrificial procedures that he witnessed during the early colonial period. Landa described the cenote sacrifices at Chichen Itza with clinical precision. Into this well they have had, and then had, the custom of throwing men alive as a sacrifice to the gods, in times of drought, and they believed that they did not die though they never saw them again. They also threw into it a great many other things, like precious stones and things which they prized. The Spanish found themselves in the paradoxical position of being simultaneously horrified by Maya sacrifices and dependent on Maya labor for their colonial economy. They needed to suppress the ritual murders that offended Christian sensibilities while preserving enough of the indigenous population to work their mines and plantations. This led to a complex campaign of cultural destruction that targeted sacrificial practices while attempting to preserve the social structures that made those practices possible. The suppression of Maya sacrifice wasn't immediate or complete. Spanish records from the colonial period document continued ritual murders well into the 17th century, with Maya priests adapting their practices to avoid detection by colonial authorities. Some ceremonies moved to remote cave systems where Spanish oversight was minimal. Others were disguised as Christian rituals, with sacrificial victims presented as martyrs or penitents whose deaths served Catholic rather than Maya deities. The Spanish also discovered that Maya sacrifice was so deeply embedded in the culture that simply banning it created new problems. Without the ritual outlets for violence that sacrifice provided, Maya communities sometimes turned to other forms of conflict that were equally disruptive to colonial order. Spanish administrators found themselves in the strange position of occasionally tolerating limited sacrificial practices as a form of social control. But the most devastating Spanish weapon against Maya sacrifice wasn't military force or religious conversion, it was disease. Smallpox, typhus, and other European pathogens decimated Maya populations so thoroughly that there simply weren't enough people left to maintain the elaborate ceremonial cycles that had sustained sacrificial practices for over a millennium. Entire priest lineages died out, taking with them the specialized knowledge that had made Maya sacrifice so sophisticated and systematic. The Spanish also targeted the material culture of sacrifice with systematic destruction. They melted down gold and jade sacrificial implements, burned codices that contained sacrificial calendars and procedures, and demolished temples where the rituals had been performed. This cultural vandalism was so thorough that much of what we know about Maya sacrifice comes from Spanish accounts rather than indigenous sources. Some Maya communities attempted to preserve their sacrificial traditions by encoding them in seemingly innocent colonial documents. Church records from Guatemala contain what appear to be baptismal lists but are actually coded references to sacrificial calendars. Land grants include descriptions of geographic features that were actually maps of sacred sites where sacrifices had been performed. These hidden records suggest that Maya scribes were attempting to preserve their culture's most sacred knowledge even as it was being systematically destroyed. The psychological impact of losing their sacrificial traditions was devastating for Maya communities. These rituals hadn't just been religious practices but the foundation of their understanding of cosmic order. Without the ability to offer blood to the gods, many Maya believed their world was literally ending, that the sun would stop rising, the rains would cease, and chaos would consume the universe. Some Spanish missionaries recognized this spiritual crisis and attempted to provide Christian substitutes for Maya sacrificial needs. They emphasized the sacrificial aspects of Catholic theology, presenting Christ's crucifixion as the ultimate blood offering that made further sacrifice unnecessary. But for many Maya, this theological substitution was inadequate. They needed the direct, immediate connection with the divine that only fresh blood could provide. The archaeological testament of terror. Modern archaeology has revealed the true scope of Maya sacrifice with a precision that would have been impossible for Spanish chroniclers to achieve. Excavations across the Maya world have uncovered evidence of ritual murder on a scale that dwarfs even the most dramatic historical accounts, painting a picture of systematic violence that sustained Maya civilization for over 2 millennia. At Caracol in Belize, archaeologists have discovered what may be the largest sacrificial complex ever found in the Maya world, a series of interconnected plazas and temples where evidence suggests over 10,000 individuals were sacrificed during the site's 600-year occupation. The sheer logistics of disposing of so many bodies required sophisticated infrastructure, drainage systems to channel blood, furnaces to cremate remains, and storage areas for the bones that were preserved for ritual use. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at Tikal have revealed massive burial complexes beneath the site's major temples, containing the remains of thousands of sacrificial victims arranged in precise geometric patterns. These underground ossuaries weren't random dumping grounds but carefully organized repositories where bodies were placed according to the type of sacrifice, the deity being honored, and the astronomical timing of their deaths. Chemical analysis of Maya skeletal remains has revealed details about sacrificial practices that no historical account could provide. Isotope studies of bone and teeth show that many victims were transported hundreds of miles from their places of birth, suggesting extensive trade networks dedicated to supplying human offerings. Trace element analysis reveals that sacrificial victims often consumed special diets in the weeks before their deaths, their bodies literally seasoned for divine consumption. The most disturbing archaeological discoveries involve evidence of systematic torture that preceded sacrifice. At Dos Pilas, researchers have found skeletons showing healed fractures that indicate victims were repeatedly injured and allowed to recover before their final deaths. Some bones show evidence of deliberate infections, suggesting that priests were experimenting with different ways to weaken victims while keeping them alive for extended periods. Microscopic analysis of obsidian blades found at sacrificial sites has revealed traces of human tissue that provide insights into the specific techniques used by Maya priests. Some blades show wear patterns consistent with repeated use for flaying, while others were clearly designed for precise heart extraction. The sophistication of these tools suggests that Maya priests had developed specialized instruments for different types of sacrifice, each optimized for maximum efficiency and spiritual impact. Perhaps most chilling are the discoveries of sacrificial workshops, areas where human bodies were systematically processed after death. At Copan, archaeologists have found evidence of facilities where bones were carved into ceremonial objects, skin was prepared for ritual use, and blood was collected and concentrated for storage. These weren't crude butcher shops but sophisticated processing centers that treated human remains as valuable raw materials for religious manufacturing. DNA analysis of sacrificial victims has revealed that many were related to each other, suggesting that entire family lines were marked for sacrifice over multiple generations. Some sites show evidence of what can only be described as human breeding programs, where captives were kept alive for years and encouraged to reproduce, their children destined from birth to serve as sacrificial offerings. The archaeological record also reveals the environmental impact of Maya sacrifice. Chemical analysis of soil samples from major ceremonial centers shows elevated levels of phosphorus and other elements associated with decomposing human remains. Some sites show evidence of contaminated water supplies, suggesting that the massive scale of sacrifice created public health problems that Maya communities had to address through engineering and urban planning. Recent discoveries have also revealed that Maya sacrifice continued much later than previously thought. Radiocarbon dating of sacrificial remains from remote sites in Guatemala shows that ritual murders were still being performed in the 18th century, over 200 years after the Spanish conquest. These late sacrifices were smaller in scale and conducted in secret, but they demonstrate the persistence of traditions that had sustained Maya civilization for millennia. The most recent archaeological work has focused on understanding the psychological and social impact of living in a society where human sacrifice was routine. Analysis of domestic sites shows evidence of chronic stress in Maya populations, elevated cortisol levels in hair samples, evidence of sleep disorders in skeletal remains, and signs of psychological trauma that suggest entire communities lived in constant fear of being selected for sacrifice. The eternal echo of ancient screams as we stand today among the ruins of Chichen Itza, Tikal, and Palenque. It's easy to admire the architectural genius of Maya civilization while forgetting the rivers of blood that flowed beneath their pyramids. These monuments weren't just impressive buildings, they were altars designed for death, their every stone positioned to optimize the flow of human sacrifice that the Maya believed kept the universe functioning. The scale of Maya sacrifice challenges our understanding of ancient civilization. This wasn't a barbaric society that killed randomly, but a sophisticated culture that had systematized murder into an art form. They developed technologies of torture that wouldn't be matched until the modern era, created bureaucracies of death that rivaled any contemporary government, and sustained these practices for over 2,000 years. But perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Maya sacrifice wasn't an aberration or a sign of cultural decay, it was the foundation upon which their greatest achievements were built. The astronomical knowledge that allowed them to predict eclipses was used to time executions. The mathematical sophistication that created their calendar was employed to calculate optimal sacrifice schedules. The artistic genius that produced their sculptures and murals was dedicated to depicting the torture and murder of human beings. The Maya believed they were maintaining cosmic balance through their sacrificial practices, ensuring that the sun continued to rise and the rains continued to fall. From their perspective, every heart torn from a living chest was an act of profound religious devotion, every child drowned in a cenote was a prayer for the survival of their civilization. They weren't monsters, they were people who had convinced themselves that systematic murder was not just acceptable but necessary for the continuation of the world. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between civilization and violence, between religious devotion and human cruelty. The Maya created one of the most sophisticated cultures in human history, yet they built it on a foundation of ritualized murder that would shock even the most hardened modern observers. Their legacy forces us to confront the possibility that civilization and barbarism aren't opposites but can coexist in ways that challenge our most basic assumptions about human progress. The Spanish conquest ended the age of Maya sacrifice, but it didn't erase the psychological and cultural patterns that had sustained it for millennia. Even today, in remote areas of Guatemala and Mexico, anthropologists have documented rituals that echo ancient sacrificial practices, animal offerings that follow the same astronomical timing, bloodletting ceremonies that mirror ancient protocols, and community festivals that reenact mythological scenes once performed with human victims. The cenotes still hold their secrets, their dark waters concealing thousands of skeletons that bear witness to humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. The ball courts still echo with phantom screams, their stone walls remembering the players who died for the entertainment of gods and crowds. And the pyramids still cast shadows that seem darker than they should, as if the blood that once flowed down their steps had permanently stained the very light that touches them. Modern Maya communities struggle with this legacy, torn between pride in their ancestors' achievements and horror at the methods used to sustain them. Some have embraced their heritage while rejecting its violent aspects, creating new traditions that honor ancient wisdom without perpetuating ancient cruelties. Others have turned away from their past entirely, finding it too painful to reconcile the beauty of Maya art and science with the brutality of Maya religion. The archaeological record continues to reveal new horrors, each excavation uncovering fresh evidence of the systematic violence that sustained Maya civilization. But it also reveals the human cost of that violence, not just in the thousands who died on sacrificial altars, but in the psychological trauma that must have affected entire populations living under the constant threat of being selected for divine service. Perhaps the most important lesson of Maya's sacrifice is that it demonstrates how easily human societies can normalize extreme violence when it's given religious or ideological justification. The Maya weren't uniquely cruel, they were human beings who had created a system that transformed murder into sacred duty, making the unthinkable seem not just acceptable but necessary. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of absolute religious authority, the risks of conflating political power with divine mandate, and the ease with which sophisticated societies can convince themselves that their most horrific practices are actually their most noble achievements. The screams that once echoed through Maya temples have been silenced by time, but their warning still resonates across the centuries. So tell us, which aspect of Maya's sacrifice disturbs you most? The systematic torture of children, the transformation of sport into execution, or the way an entire civilization convinced itself that murder was worship? Share your thoughts below, and remember that understanding history's darkest chapters helps us recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time. If this journey into the heart of Maya darkness has gripped you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration of humanity's capacity for both greatness and horror. Until then, remember that the stories we tell here at Scandalous Pasts are fictional tales that may or may not be inspired by real events, but the lessons they teach about human nature are all too real. The pyramids of the Maya still stand, monuments to both human achievement and human cruelty. They remind us that civilization is fragile, that progress is not inevitable, and that the line between devotion and destruction is thinner than we'd like to believe. In their shadows, we glimpse not just the past but ourselves and the eternal question of what we're willing to sacrifice in the name of our deepest beliefs.